Okay, so this is the first video where we're actually going to be talking about some of the um, concepts from Stat 300. So we're going to be following the organizational scheme of the OER textbook. Um, so this is chapter one. We're starting with section 1.1, what we choose to study, which is where we're going to start to understand some of the basic terminology and what the objective of statistics ultimately is. So we want to start with understanding what our goal is. In statistics, we're going to have a variety of examples where we're going to be examining effects between different variables. We're going to be looking at how the same variable affects different populations. May be interested in um, interaction effects. We may be interested in seeing how two things correlate with each other. But ultimately, all of that we can distill down to we have an essential question, a guiding question. So for instance, and I will link the article when we're done here. If you go to pewresearch.org, which is the website for a nonprofit um, organization that does conduct studies to try to understand um, public opinion and a variety of other things. They have recently done a feature on whether parents and teenagers in the United States have this similar or dissimilar views on whether it's easier, harder, or about the same to be a teenager today than it was 20 years ago. So for reference, we're in 2025. 20 years ago was 2005, right? So we're looking at a generational gap. And now the question that we have here, uh, we're going to be interested in how do we measure this? We're going to be interested in who do we ask, right? Who is our target audience? And how can we effectively answer this question? So let's start with this. Our broad scheme here of what we're looking at is we imagine that we have some population. Now, we use the word population um, in this case to mean actually a group of people, a very large group of people, but it doesn't necessarily have to be people. It could be objects, it could be um, processes. It's a very generic term, but essentially what we're discussing here, if we're saying a population is the group of people that we're going to study. In our case here, if we're interested in understanding US parents and teens, we may be interested in um, the population of US adults who have children, teenage children. That's one group that we may be interested in asking this question of. Um, and we may also be interested in asking teenagers who of today, right? So these are two very broad populations, right? We're talking about millions of people. So we might want to narrow it down somewhat, depending on the scope of what we're trying to study, right? So maybe we're just interested in 13 to, let's say, 18-year-olds. Now, we can't ask everyone what they think, but we're going to be interested in taking what we call a sample. So out of this enormous group, right? We're talking about millions of people here. We're going to extract something called a sample. So let's say we take a group of people, a smaller group of people necessarily, okay? And we're going to call that a sample. And these are the people that we're actually going to ask our questions or examine. Now, it's not necessarily the case that we're always going to be able to measure something directly. Sometimes the best we can do is just ask them a question. But in our case here, what we're interested in asking, um, whether the public perception of adults versus teenagers, of whether it's harder or easier to be a teenager today than it was in 2005. In this Pew Research feature, they asked 1,453 adults and children. Now, that may be asking them to respond to a survey through email. It could be a telephone call. It could be asking them directly in person-to-person interviews, right? So part of our task when we're studying statistics is to understand proper sampling techniques, which we'll discuss in 1.3, um, and to understand the effects of how that is going to impact what we understand about the population. So, for instance, let's say we're doing a comparison, right? So let's say the question is it harder, was it harder back then or is it harder today, right? And to, gather that response from both parents and from teenagers. Now, in this particular feature, they see this response. They saw that 69% of parents say that it's harder to be a teen in 2025 than it was 20 years ago. 44% of teens say the same thing. So two different groups, two different samples. And these figures here, these percentages, are coming from the sample itself. For that reason, these figures are what we call statistics. So this is kind of a loaded term, right? A statistic is a figure that represents something about a sample, whereas we're interested in capturing how well this represents the populations as a whole. So we're interested in the parameters. Now, we have a variety of parameters that we're going to be studying in this class, but in particular, the one that we're going to be interested in is something called a proportion. So how many people say this versus how many people say that? And so we have here our two sample proportions, right? So we have this notation that indicates that it's um, a statistic for parents and for teens. And maybe we're interested in the population proportion for parents and for teens. Now, let's just briefly go back and think about, okay, so this is all well and good, but the question remains, so what exactly are we interested in when we're talking about a proportion, right? So this is where we are bridging the gap now to talking about what we're actually collecting, right? And this is the word that we typically start with in a study of statistics. Now, data is plural. A single data point would be called a datum. We don't really call it that. It's fine. We don't need to get into that. But data is any observation. Oops. that is relevant to what we're going to be discussing in the context of this study. So now it can be an observation, as in literally an observation, as in you, the researcher, are observing something, or it can be a collected measurement. It could be a combination of things. But the data are what support both the calculation of the statistics and to help us understand the population as a whole. Having said that, we're going to be discussing the different kinds of data and what measures, ways of representing them are appropriate for the particular needs that we have. Um, and lastly, before we move on, we should talk about some other things, such as breadth, meaning how widely is this applicable, right? Across how many populations? Here we're talking about um, parents and teenagers, but which parents, right? Did we do something where we deliberately selected a specific generation, or have we narrowed it down too much? Is it wider than we need? How do we generalize? And this might have to do with how large of a sample we took. Now, comparative to our millions of adults and children that live in the United States, this is a relatively small sample. But we'll see in this course that actually the tools that we have serve us pretty well as long as we understand that it's a representative sample. So we'll get into what that means later. But whether a sample is representative is also essential. Lastly, we want to make sure that we're not introducing any bias. So is our sampling method appropriate? Have we inadvertently ignored some variable that could be responsible for what we're seeing? So we're going to be interested in making sure that we're eliminating bias as much as we can. I said lastly already, but there is one last thing that we're interested in, and that's the significance of what we're observing. So how significant is this result? In other words, is 69% a large proportion, or does that mean that, just over two-thirds, that's not that big of an effect versus 44% of teens? We'll discuss all that later. There's no one precise way to say that something is significant or not until we discuss significance at the statistical level later on in the course. So in the next video, we'll discuss the types of data, how to classify them, and some examples to help you understand exactly what we're looking for.